Hi, welcome to Al-Muqaddimah. My name is Syawish. A few years ago, I made a video on homosexuality in the Islamic world, and in that video, I spent most of my time talking about male homosexuality. That's because the sources on male homosexuality are simply much more plentiful. However, there are quite a few sources from the Islamic world that talk about female homosexuality. So today, we're gonna discuss everyone's favorite topic, lesbians. Before we begin, I'd like to tell everyone that my merchandise store is now up on almuqaddimah.com, where you can find really cool wall posters like the Timeline of Islamic History, which condenses 1400 plus years of Islamic history into a beautiful timeline. There are two versions of that chart, one with portraits of important figures and one without, so you can pick whichever one you prefer. We also have a map of the fall of Al-Andalus, which shows, century by century, how Muslim empires lost ground in Spain and Portugal until their eventual collapse on the Iberian Peninsula. So be sure to check it out. That's the best way to support Al-Muqaddimah and show off some love for Islamic history. Alternatively, if you want to support Al-Muqaddimah financially, you can join these awesome patrons over on patreon.com. The links to everything are in the description. Back to the video. Now, interestingly enough, most medieval texts from the Islamic world that concern homosexuality usually begin by highlighting the fact that homosexuality in Islam is indeed prohibited. So I'll start with that too, I guess. Homosexuality is prohibited in Islam according to all scholars of Islamic theology. So don't do it. Don't do it. Just don't do it. Also, I'd like to add that other than poetry about female homosexuality, most of what we have on the topic comes from male authors who have their own problems, which we have to keep in mind. For example, they wouldn't have much real access to actual lesbians and the intimate details of their relationships. Plus, there's probably a bit of misogyny mixed in there as well. Also, the terms I'm going to use, such as lesbian, are anachronistic and perhaps inappropriate for a medieval setting, but I'm being loose with the terms here in this video. All the terms in this video are quite loose. Don't at me about the definitions, please. That being said, let's talk about lesbians. Even before the arrival of Islam, Arab literature mentions some lesbian lovers. For example, two lovers named Hind and Bint Hassan Yamami were used as examples in poetry in the same way that today we might use Romeo and Juliet in English or Layla and Majnun in Arabic. Now, Hind here was the queen of a pre-Islamic ruler of the Lakhmid state, allegedly. We don't really know much about this particular character other than what we get from love poetry. We don't even know if she was one person or multiple. There's another couple we find in poetry, Hind bint al-Nu'man and al-Zarqa. They might be the same as Hind and Bint Hassan Yamami, but it's not clear. Hind, in this case, is the daughter of the aforementioned Lakhmid king and not his wife. The great Arab poet Al-Farazdak is considered one of the earliest Islamic era poets of Arabic and lived during the Umayyad Caliphate period. He writes, "I was devoted to you in a time that you bestowed kindly, like Hind was devoted to Hassan Yamami's daughter." Hind and Al-Zarqa's love story seems to have been held up as an example of deep and true love because Al-Zarqa dies and Hind then becomes distraught over her death and she rejects all kinds of, quote, worldly pleasures. This story seems to indicate that people understood the love between two women as being more than simply an exercise in pleasure or a sin or even a medical condition. Then we have other examples of lesbian lovers in Arabic literature. There's also a rich vocabulary used to describe all kinds of lesbians. One of the most common terms here is sahkiya, which literally means grinder. I think that's because the lesbians were really into the hustle culture. Interestingly, in Cantonese, a slang term for lesbian is tofu grinder. This term, grinder, like all things gay, can be traced back to ancient Greece, where the term tribadis was used to refer to lesbians and also means someone who rubs or grinds. That's where we get the term tribadism or tribbing, which, you know. Another fun fact Another fun fact, there was a term specifically used for women who became lesbians because they didn't want to get pregnant. The term is mutaqiyya. They were apparently not uncommon. We get, for example, actual poetry written by said women clearly mentioning that they chose to love other women out of the fear of pregnancy. So already here, our modern understanding of sexuality can be seen in the medieval sources, but also simultaneously is absent from them. Like, if we have women who allegedly are attracted to both men and women, but they choose women, today we would call them bisexual. But of course, they probably didn't understand these terms and these identities in the same way that we do today. Some of these terms that we find in medieval texts are too graphic for YouTube. I won't be sharing much about them directly, but if you want, you can certainly find sources for this video in the description, and you can do your own research if you wanna, get the juicy details. According to Ahmad ibn Yusuf al-Tifashi, a scholar from the 13th century who wrote quite a bit about lesbians, lesbians didn't call themselves grinders or sakiya, rather they called themselves tharifa, which means witty. And that, I think, is a very lesbian thing to do. Apparently, a woman calling herself witty was kind of a subtle way of saying that she ate from the other side of the buffet. Al-Tifash's book is full of lesbian poetry, some of which is very graphic, which I'm not gonna read, but I will put on the screen so you can read some of it if you want. As far as women during the Islamic era go, we do know of quite a few women who clearly preferred other women and even wrote poetry about them. According to Al-Tabari, the Abbasid Caliph Al-Hadi beheaded 2 of his slave girls when he found out that they were lovers and caught them in bed together. After him, Al-Ma'mun had a courtier named Bathal who wrote poetry for 1 or more female lovers. And according to Abul Faraj al-Isfahani, who wrote a book about songs, Al-Ma'mun knew about this. Bathal wrote this. Bathal, according to Al-Isfahani, was the best singer of her time and became quite rich and influential. She got proposals from many rich men, but refused them all. We have another famous woman who prefers female company from literature, the fictional Princess Noura, who is a Byzantine princess in the epic known as Sirat al-Hama from probably the 11th century CE. She is a warrior princess who refuses men, the exact quote here is, loves women and detests men, and she's not any kind of villain in the story. In fact, she is forcibly married to a man that she's actually already in love with, but that's a different story. And then there are problems, so she has to be, quote, domesticated. And then she converts to Islam and then fights on the Muslim side of the war as well. There are other characters in this epic that seem to prefer men. In Jawami al-Ladha, or the Encyclopedia of Pleasure, the 10th century writer Ali ibn Nasr al-Katib writes a ton of stories about homosexual couples. In the same century, we get the Fihrist of Ibn al-Nadim, which is kind of an encyclopedia of people and things and books from around Ibn al-Nadim's time and before it as well. And in the Fihrist, we get a mention of 12 books that are solely dedicated to lesbian couples. However, none of these books have unfortunately survived. In the 11th century, we find the poetry of a woman named Walada ibn al-Mustakfi, who was an Umayyad princess from Cordoba. Her father was Muhammad III, who was one of the last caliphs of the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba. She wrote poetry for both male and female lovers. Some of her poetry is about her student, Mukhja ibn al-Dayani, another poetess. Apparently, the poetry was so explicit and graphic that later writers simply refused to copy it, so it's sadly been lost. But Walada was certainly into guys as well. According to some of Mukhja's poetry, she was even pregnant at one point. Then, in the 15th century, we get a story from Leo Africanus, who traveled throughout Africa. He writes that in Fez, Morocco, there were women who claimed to be possessed by spirits and claimed to be healers and being able to divine the future. But in reality, they were, quote, sahakat, which is a Latin transliteration of sahakiyat, or grinders. He writes that they lured women into having sex with them. Other lesbians would pretend to be sick in order to go to these healers. Now, Leo Africanus' quote can certainly be questioned, but some of it must be true. When it comes to male homosexuality, we see homosexuality prevalent among mystics and hermits who might even choose the life of a mystic because of his homosexual tendencies. So within these female mystics, it is also quite plausible. So for sure, there's no shortage of female homosexual literature from the medieval Islamic world. I have only talked about a few here, but there are certainly quite a few more interesting ones as well. However, we don't know of many historical women who had female lovers in the same way that we know of many historical men who had male lovers. That's likely because of the fact that the ratio of male to female in Islamic history in general is quite heavily leaning towards men. But that doesn't mean that we don't have evidence of normal women who had homosexual relationships. Al-Tifashi, for example, also tells us that lesbian relationships were quite public, just as male homosexual or gay relationships were. He writes, "One of them will spend money on the other in the same way that a man does on his lover, but much more until the spending is exaggerated to hundreds and thousands. I witnessed a woman in Morocco who had a great deal of money and wide estate, so she dispensed a great deal of jewelry on her lover. When she ran out of this and people began to reproach and blame her exceedingly, she warranted her lover the entire estate, which came to about 5,000 dinars." He also tells us something about the intimate details of their sex life, which I'm not sure about how accurate that is, but it's still quite interesting. He tells us about the saffron massage, which is a position, I guess, and it gets its name from the fact that this is how saffron was rubbed on cloth. I love the part where he assures the reader that you can't press the two lips simultaneously, like he has any experience with that. Muhammad ibn Ali al-Yemeni gives us quite a vivid picture of the various kinds of lesbians that were found around him. Some of them love grinding but do not hate the Second kind is a woman who is masculine, muthathakira in appearance, and this becomes apparent in her from an early age. She competes with men and resembles them and haughtily rejects submitting to them. She rejects being and undermines penises and competes with men over deflowering other women, and she equals the men in jealousy over and protection of women. So clearly, some of the concepts that are very modern to us were present already, such as butch, top, bottom, tomboys, and femboys as well. But of course, these terms and their current understandings don't perfectly align with medieval terms. A medical textbook from the 12th century by one Abu Nasr al-Samawuli even discusses the reasons why some women might take female lovers, and he does this without much judgment. He's basically discussing it as any other human behavior. One of the reasons that he gives is that some women just don't like the touch of a beard and want to press their cheeks against a soft cheek, to which I'm like, who doesn't? Anyhow, I'll put some of his quotes on screen. You can pause and read if you want. Al-Qindi as well talked about the medical reasoning behind why some women become lesbians. Some scholars actually go as far as to recommend a diet for pregnant and breastfeeding women to make sure that their daughter doesn't get the quote itch that makes them want to grind. A lot of the literature that surrounds female homosexuality is an attempt to understand it by men, which I think is kind of interesting on its own. These male authors certainly didn't need to know why men might indulge in homosexuality, but they were very curious about why women do. There also seems to have been something of an ego thing, maybe, because we see some literature that concerns men and women arguing about which is better, penetrative sex or grinding. The aforementioned Bathal is reported as having changed the lyrics of a song in the presence of Al-Ma'mun to say that rubbing was more pleasurable than penetration, which Al-Ma'mun then corrects her on. However, beyond pleasure and necessity, lesbianism was also a tool of resistance against the patriarchy in a way. Again, I'm using modern terms here, and people might not have understood them in the same way back then. Women who didn't want to live the heteronormative lifestyle with a husband and 2.3 kids chose to take female lovers in order to avoid being subservient to their husband. Sharif al-Adrisi, a scholar from the 11th century, writes, "There are also women who are more intelligent than the others. They possess many of the ways of men so that they resemble them even in their movements, the manner in which they talk, and their voice. Such women would like to be the active partner, and they would like to be superior to the man who makes this possible for them. Such a woman does not shame herself either if she seduces whom she desires. If she has no inclination, he cannot force her to make love. This makes it difficult for her to submit to the wishes of men and brings her to lesbian love. Most of the women with these characteristics are to be found among the educated and elegant women, the scribes, Quran readers, and female scholars. What I think is even more interesting is that women's sexuality was not repressed at large. No one asks, okay, why do women want to have more pleasurable sex? In the way that the Christian society around the same time might have. Even today, people think of a woman who seeks more pleasurable sex as a sinful harlot, but that was not the case in the medieval Islamic world. In fact, Islam and the Islamic world from the beginning were quite open about sexuality, which is why the Christians thought of them as sex-driven deviants. However, that's a topic for another video. Do subscribe because I have a whole slate of videos about sexuality in the Islamic world coming. Something that I think might have been at play here as well, in my opinion, is the role that genealogy played in the Arab society. What I'm about to say is missing from all the literature that I've read, so, don't take it too seriously if you don't want to. Because of the tribal nature of the Arabs, blood ties meant everything, and so Islam itself is quite protective about these things, which is why sex that can result in offspring is kept under guard. So to speak, it's considered a big deal, but sex that cannot result in offspring isn't taken as seriously by medieval Islamic society. That, mixed with the fact that women were allowed to indulge in their sexuality, results in a society where no one really cares if two women are having sex. So what was the reaction of religious scholars to female homosexuality? It doesn't seem that religious scholars were that much against it or that they took it very seriously, especially when compared to male homosexuality. Whenever someone mentions male homosexuality in medieval texts, they always criticize it, and they make sure to highlight the fact that it's haram or forbidden. The debates about male homosexuality are what the punishment for it should be. And there's no debate about its legality. People choose to ignore the fact that it's haram 100%, but they always make sure to mention that it is haram. However, with female homosexuality, that's not the case. With women, some go as far as to question whether grinding is actually even intercourse. For example, Ibn Hazm tells us of how certain cultures within the Islamic world treated matters of female sexuality and homosexuality differently. He tells us that certain groups of Muslims disagreed on matters of female masturbation with aids, and by aids I mean recreations of certain phallic objects. Some denominations licensed it, grinding, as Ibn Jarih has told me about Al-Hasan al-Basri, who did not see a woman inserting something as wretched, simply that she was seeking refuge from scandal, and this way she can do it without committing fornication. Others have said it is forbidden without exception. He also tells us that some cultures prohibit female homosexuality and punish it. He says that the people who punish it do so at the authority of a hadith, i.e. the saying of the Prophet, that clearly marks that grinding is fornication and hence prohibited. Then he even cites someone named Abu Muhammad who argues that the hadith that labels grinding as fornication is actually unreliable. However, Ibn Hazm pulls back, and then he brings in other hadiths to show that sexual intercourse between two unmarried people is prohibited, and since two women can't get married, they cannot have sex. However, this attitude clearly changes in the 14th and 15th centuries, when lesbianism is considered to be the work of the devil. For example, Al-Noveri in Nihayat al-Arab tells us that Viking women were taught grinding by the devil because the Viking men started to sodomize them and swap them. They lived a long time in their country, worshipping God Almighty, the way He ought to be, and then they deviated from this and worshipped statues, and they began to practice sodomizing women and swapping them. This became unbearable for the women, and so the devil came to them as a woman and taught them grinding, and so they did it. At this point, there's a clear shift in the general attitude towards homosexuality, both male and female. Part of the reason behind that is that the Islamic world had been devastated by the Mongols and the Black Death. And many Muslims saw this as a result of deviation from the path of God, and hence they had attracted God's punishment. In the following centuries, As Islamdom recovered, male homosexual literature popped up again, but female homosexual literature did not. Then, history repeated itself. The Islamic world came under foreign powers during the colonial era, and these puritanical and reformist movements started popping up again. Today, we live in the shadows of these very movements. After this, we do get mentions of lesbianism, but we don't get much poetry or stories as we did before. For example, some travelers to the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century mentioned that men were reluctant to let their wives go to bathhouses because they had female lovers there. The Sultan even appointed guards to female bathhouses, but given that the guards were male, I can't imagine that was very effective. There's also a traveler's account that tells us that in the Ottoman Empire, whenever the women of the harem wanted cucumbers, the order was to send them sliced. Although the traveler had no way of knowing what went on in the harem, so this is likely just made up. There are also so many Orientalist paintings of these things, but I've decided to ignore them because they're likely just imaginative. Then we get this graphic image from the Mughal Empire of India. Mughal art is actually full of nasty stuff like this. However, largely speaking, we see a decline in lesbian and lesbian-aligned literature. Literature about male homosexuality remains as prevalent as ever after the 1500s, however. So it can't be that the attitude towards homosexuality simply changed, but something else must have changed at that time as well. Now, as I've shown in this video, hopefully convincingly enough, there is plenty of literature from the medieval Islamic world that shows that female homosexuality was fairly common and accepted within that society. One thing that's very clearly missing from lesbian-adjacent literature is, thankfully so, pederasty. In literature about male homosexuality, a vast majority of homosexual relationships are between older men and younger boys, many of them conspicuously beardless. However, within female homosexuality literature, that's not quite present. Of course, we do see a lot of couples with social and financial imbalance, and by modern standards, even those aren't quite fully consensual, but that's a conversation for another day. There is literature about women and underaged boys, however, but that's not homosexuality, so it's not relevant in this video. Like I said, I left a lot on the cutting room floor for this video, so be sure to check out the sources in the description to read more about this topic. It's quite fascinating. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon. On the screen right now, you can see the names and tiers of the patrons. You can join them by pledging $1 or more to support the channel. Thank you for watching.